The Olympic flame is lit in Beijing, but this year the world is focusing on more than just what's happening inside the city's stadium. Russia's president is in Beijing for the opening of the Winter Olympics, but while there, he met in person with Chinese leader Xi Jinping for the first time in 2 years. India announces a last-minute diplomatic boycott of the Olympics, but for a different reason than most. Beijing selected a Chinese commander to be an Olympic torchbearer, despite the man's role in the deadly border clashes with India. The House passes a bill to help the U.S. compete with China, but it remains to be seen how Washington plans to hold Beijing accountable. And a video clip triggers outrage online and revised debates over a crime going back decades in China. A suspected victim of bride trafficking, one woman is found chained inside a shed. Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. The Beijing Winter Olympics has begun. Inside the stadium, the Olympic flame was lit during the opening ceremony Friday. This year's games mark a milestone for Beijing, making it the first city ever to host both the Summer and Winter Olympics. Officials see it as a triumph for the Chinese Communist Party, amid Beijing's efforts to raise its standing in the international community. The event may also help CCP leader Xi Jinping hold on to his power for a third term during elections later this year. But issues outside the stadium are casting shadows on the event, with human rights issues, protests, and strict pandemic rules rising to the forefront of Olympic headlines. Those in town for the Games say it's an Olympics like no other. Athletes are confined to the city's so-called Olympic bubble. The sectioned-off area isolates them and other staff from the general public, aiming to stem virus spread. It comes complete with high fences, facial recognition cameras, and separate transportation. Daily virus COVID-19 tests are mandatory, and even short walks outside are a rarity. And besides pandemic protocols, many are wrestling with another dilemma between staying quiet to support their sports and their countries and standing up against China's human rights record. Some have weighed the idea of speaking out, but have been warned against it for their own safety.
I fear for their safety if they do.
Outside the Olympic bubble, the communist regime is working hard to keep that criticism quiet, reportedly putting dissidents under house arrest and clamping down on social media posts. With a number of high-profile visitors in town for the Games, one of them took the opportunity for a meeting beforehand. Russian President Vladimir Putin met China's Xi Jinping in Beijing ahead of the opening ceremony. The Russian leader's visit comes amid growing Chinese support for Moscow.
As for our bilateral relations, they are developing linearly with the spirit of friendship and strategic partnership and have reached an unprecedented level.
According to China's Xinhua News Agency, Xi said China and Russia are committed to deepening back-to-back strategic cooperation. In a joint statement, the two countries affirmed that their new relationship is superior to any political or military alliance of the Cold War era, stating friendship between the two states has no limits. There are no forbidden areas of cooperation. They called for NATO to halt its expansion, and Moscow said it fully supports Beijing's stance on Taiwan and opposes Taiwanese independence in any form. Putin's presence at the opening ceremony makes him the highest-profile guest at the Games, a symbolic move in light of the decision by the U.S., Britain, and others not to send officials to the Olympics in protest of China's human rights abuses. The meeting between Putin and China's Xi seems to come at a curious time. NTD's David Zhang and the host of China Insider explains there may be more to the timing of their talks. Let's take a closer look.
2022 is a huge year for China. The country is hosting its second Olympics Games, but the grand event is happening under very unusual circumstances. The global pandemic and a Western diplomatic boycott of the event. Despite the situation, Russian President Vladimir Putin's presence at the game seems to send a different message to the world.
You can see that China really wants Russia to be there to support China during the event, even as this pandemic is raging.
NTD host David Zhang says there's something else behind the apparent display of solidarity between China and Russia.
is it really shows that to the West, to the United States and allies, that there's this authoritarian world order that they're trying to build.
Putin was in Beijing on Friday, partly to attend the Winter Olympics opening ceremony and to meet with China's communist leader Xi Jinping. It's the first in-person meeting between Xi and Putin in nearly 2 years. During his visit, Putin hailed what he called his country's unprecedented ties with China. But Zhang says his close friendship with China is just for show.
What Putin wants is some sort of an affirmation from China that if I do get sanctioned, that you will come to my aid.
That's as Russia remains busy on another front after it sent over 10,000 troops to its shared border with Ukraine. The U.S. is now threatening to sanction Russia along with China.
If we just do one sanction, the other side will still be able to supply. And that only results in a closer China and Russia relationship. So in this case, we can see that Putin is sort of dragging Xi Jinping on this journey with him.
In recent years, China has been facing a deteriorating international environment. International diplomatic boycotts, like the one against the Beijing Olympics, illustrate how other countries are distancing themselves from China. Zhang says Russia will form its own ally circle with the countries that send representatives to the Olympics, adding that trade and military development will bring them together in case of a face-off with the West. But Zhang says a real partnership between China and Russia against the U.S. is unlikely to happen anytime soon.
I think if the West can give Russia some leeways, we can prevent the closer ties between Russia and China.
Only time will tell.
But that's not all on the China-Russia front. In other news, the United States is warning Chinese firms not to help Russia if Russia decides to invade Ukraine. State Department spokesman Ned Price cautioned the firms on Thursday, saying if Russia invades Ukraine, the U.S. will sanction Russia. He said their methods may include export control measures. This would lead to a shortage of certain critical products in Russia. And if Chinese companies help Russia to get these products and go around the U.S. sanctions, the U.S. will go after them. Price made the remarks after China said it and Russia had coordinated their positions on Ukraine.
We have an array of tools that we can deploy if we see foreign companies, including those in China, doing their best to backfill U.S. export control actions, to evade them, to get around them.
Western countries say any invasion of Ukraine by Russia will bring sanctions on Moscow. Washington says this may include financial sanctions. In the United States, the House passed a bill aimed at boosting U.S. competitiveness with communist China. On Capitol Hill today, the House passed the America Competes Act. It passed almost along party lines, with most of the yes votes from the Democratic Party. Our reporter Melina Weiskup has the details.
So the lack of Republican support on this bill comes as no surprise. We've heard from House Republicans all week that they are opposed to this bill. That some of them are even calling it the America Concedes Act because they say it doesn't do enough to challenge China and be tough on China. Now, another thing about this bill is that it does include some of those Build Back Better provisions, specifically the climate change proposals. That may be because the Senate right now has stalled that Build Back Better bill. So with that piece of the Biden agenda stalled, House Democrats took this opportunity and included some of those climate change pieces in this America Competes Act. Now, the bill actually calls for increased cooperation with China to address climate change, while at the same time trying to crack down on them for their human rights abuses. Now, earlier this week, I asked Speaker Pelosi how they can balance this relationship. How can you try to increase cooperation with China while at the same time trying to hold them accountable for human rights? Here's how she responded. How can you ensure that while increasing that cooperation, you can also be sure that the Chinese Communist Party is taking the sanctions in Xinjiang seriously and not try to get around those sanctions?
Well, we are very serious about the Uyghur legislation that we passed in a bipartisan way. We'll have the funding to fund our follow-up on checking on what companies might be using products coming from prison labor camps. So again, we cannot say, because we hope you'll do something on climate, that we can ignore the fact that you're committing genocide of a population in your country. That's just not going to happen.
Now, passing it through the House doesn't mean it's a done deal. The fight is not over. It still has to go over to the Senate side and garner enough Republican support to get it to Biden's desk. But ultimately, I think what we'll see is a genuine bipartisan discussion on this bill. Ultimately, I expect those more domestic areas to stay in the bill, such as the CHIPS Act, because we know that that will help the production with our those computer chips that have a shortage right now, as well as the investments in the education part of it, trying to invest more in that education to create more innovation and technology. I expect that will also stay in, but ultimately, I think we're going to see a very strong and genuine bipartisan discussion on this, and some version of it will make it to Biden's desk. Reporting in Washington, D.C., Melina Weisskopf, NTD News.
The 2020 Winter Games are here, but what world leaders are attending? Beijing revealed its guest list Friday, and over 20 influential foreign visitors made the cut. Russian President Vladimir Putin was the first to confirm his presence at the Games. United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres soon followed, along with Director General Tedros of the World Health Organization. From Europe, both Poland and Serbia's presidents are on the list. Leaders from Africa, Asia, and the Middle East also accepted the invitation. Among them, Egypt's president, Thailand's prince and princess, the emir of Qatar, and Saudi Arabia's crown prince. But as those nations seem to express support for the Beijing Games, some democratic nations are standing up to oppose them. The U.S., Britain, Canada, Australia, and Denmark announced diplomatic boycotts of the Games. That's driven by China's record of human rights violations, including its suppression of Uyghurs in Xinjiang. Others are taking a less direct approach. The Norwegian and Swedish royal families usually attend the Winter Games, but they are opting not to go this year, citing the pandemic. Compared to Beijing's hosting of the 2008 Summer Olympics, this year's event comes amid worsening relations with many Western nations. Back then, heads of 80 countries appeared at the Games, including then U.S. President George W. Bush and former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd. Speaking of diplomatic boycotts, one country is making a last-minute addition to the list. India announced a diplomatic boycott of the Beijing Olympics Thursday, one day before the event's official start, but not because of China's human rights abuses.
That our chargé d'affaires of the Embassy of India in Beijing will not be attending the opening or the closing ceremony of the Beijing 22 Winter Olympics.
Instead, the boycott is due to more personal reasons, specifically that Beijing chose a commander who took part in deadly border clashes with India to be an Olympic torchbearer.
It is indeed regrettable that the Chinese side has chosen to politicize an event like the Olympics.
Images show Chinese military commander Qi Bao in the honored role, among those relaying the Olympic flame. He fought in China's 2020 border dispute with India, which left at least 20 Indian soldiers dead. The border clash proved the deadliest between the two countries in some 40 years. Reports from Beijing are sharing first looks at the Olympics opening ceremony. Thousands of journalists from around the world worked under strict COVID-19 restrictions during the event, which kicked off Friday evening local time. Like athletes and other staff, reporters are confined to what's called the Olympic bubble or closed loop, designed to isolate them from the general population. Under those rules, journalists are only allowed to visit a limited number of sites and aren't allowed to move freely through the Chinese capital. Vicky Ivanovic, a senior reporter from Croatia's national broadcaster HRT, described the situation, saying journalists feel like they're in jail.
We feel here like we are in jail. We can't go out of the hotel, police is outside, the big fence is there. I can't feel Olympic spirit. Maybe when everything starts, it will be different, but I don't know. It's really, really weird.
Early Friday morning, a reporter for Dutch public broadcaster NOS was pulled away while reporting live on the Dutch national news. He had been standing nearby Beijing's National Stadium. The Chinese man forcing them out of the area was heard speaking in a seemingly thick Beijing area accent. He told the journalist that reporting in the area was not allowed and instructed him to stay further away. The Dutch journalist attempted to report from a number of nearby locations, but shooting video there was prohibited. Outside China, demonstrations are popping up around the world in protest of the Games. Human rights activists are speaking out against Beijing. In Germany's capital, a dozen supporters of Tibet Initiative held a protest at a landmark in Berlin, the Brandenburg Gate. They said Germany should have diplomatically boycotted the Games, just like the US, the UK, and other countries. And in the Czech Republic, protesters in front of the capital city's Chinese embassy spoke out for Falun Gong practitioners, Tibetans, China's Christians, Uyghurs, and Hong Kongers.
We want to highlight the crimes being committed by the Chinese Communist Party and point out the absurdity that is that the Olympic Games, which should be a symbol of respect and friendship, are taking place in a country which violates human rights, commits genocide and crimes against humanity.
Meanwhile, in India, exiled Tibetans burned the Chinese flag and held a hunger strike to protest the Beijing Olympics. And in Turkey, hundreds of protesters from China's Uyghur Muslim ethnic group demonstrated, calling for a boycott of the Games. $6 for a can of Coke plus a 20% service charge. That's a rough idea of soaring food prices inside the Beijing Olympics closed loop. New York Times reporter Amy Qing posted about her experience inside the loop, including a photo of the menu, supposedly from the Olympics Media Center dining hall. Qing calls the food situation exceedingly grim and says no outside food delivery is allowed either. A reporter from the Australian Broadcasting Corporation replied to Qing, saying, "Let's see, 78 yuan for a small can of Qingtao beer," referring to a typo on the menu which should read beer, not bear. That's a little over $12. The higher end of the same drink, the same brand and same size, usually costs no more than $1 in China. The reporter, Bill Birtles, later found a more extreme price. Pointing it out, he said 58 for a Watson soda water. That's about $9. A reply to that comment also gives a reminder, saying the 20% service charge is not included. Besides the Olympics, a video clip is sparking outrage on Chinese social media. It shows a mother being locked up in a shed. The incident touches on a long-running problem in China, bride trafficking. Here's more.
A viral video is sending shockwaves through China. In it, a blogger approached a woman chained inside a shed.
Are you cold? Let me get you a jacket. Let me go get a jacket for you.
The camera also captures the woman's poor living conditions and small space, showing a bowl of food sitting on her bed, which takes up most of the room.
Can you understand what I'm saying?
The woman spoke a few sentences, but her words were unintelligible. The blogger later went to get a jacket for the woman. Video captions explain it was about 30 degrees Fahrenheit, and that the woman is actually a mother of 8 children.
Guys, look at what this woman has gone through in weather like this.
Around the woman's neck is a metal chain shackling her to a wall. The video ignited a social media storm after it was published. Many users left comments suspecting she was a victim of human trafficking. Later, other videos featuring the woman's family emerged online. In one of them, someone asked the father, her husband, why he had the courage to have 8 children in such a poor financial situation.
It's not that I like kids. I had been single until I was 34 years old. Other people looked down on me because of it.
Local authorities deny the woman is a human trafficking victim. They say she has a mental disorder and sometimes responds to her family violently. The husband is reportedly under investigation. The discussion seems to have caught the eye of China's censorship arm. Multiple Chinese influencers say their related posts have been removed. It's unclear if the mother is a victim of human trafficking, but the issue is renewing attention to a long-standing problem in China, bride trafficking. The country has at least 30 million more men than women, and many of those men are having trouble finding a wife, especially if they're from poor rural areas. So some of them turn to traffickers and opt to buy a wife instead. Reports say most of the trafficked women are from southwestern China and underdeveloped regions like Yunnan and Guizhou. They're mainly sold to men in southeastern China. Neighboring countries like Cambodia, Vietnam, Pakistan, and North Korea are also sources of bride trafficking. Price ranges for the trafficked women vary, totaling anywhere from a little over $30 to more than $40,000. The scale of bride trafficking is hard to estimate due to a lack of official statistics. Here's what we can find so far. In the late 80s, almost 50,000 women were trafficked to Guizhou, a region in southeastern China. And from 2013 to 2017, over 20,000 women and girls from Burma or Myanmar were trafficked to just one province in China. How did bride trafficking come about? Research says Beijing's one-child policy contributed to the problem. China's female population percentage has been dropping since Beijing put the policy in place. Many Chinese families preferred to raise sons, given that they were only allowed one child. That's because a son is expected to stay and support his parents, while a daughter will eventually marry into another family. Reports and victims say Chinese authorities are complicit in the bride trafficking chain, explaining they often ignore cries for help. One victim of bride trafficking shared her experience on Chinese social media. Her name is Ma Panyan. Ma says her uncle sold her to a man when she was 12 years old for a little over $600. Ma reached out to her local police station for help, but the police chief pretended as if nothing had happened after accepting a bribe from her uncle. That bribe included eggs and cured meat. She wrote online, in the eyes of the police chief, trafficked women are worth less than some eggs and cured meat. In some cases, trafficking victims have tried to escape but failed. And in forced marriage, domestic violence and marital rape are common. In 2014, Chinese media covered the story of a woman trafficked from northern China to the south. Suffering from a mental disorder, her husband locks her up at home. Reports show some trafficked women are even sold several times, like one case Chinese reporters discovered in Inner Mongolia. That woman was sold to different families at least 4 times, once while she was still pregnant. A professor from a top Chinese law school says China's criminal law lags behind international standards when it comes to human trafficking.
What's the penalty for those that have bought a woman? Up to 3 years of a sentence. Up to 3 years.
He goes on to call the penalty too lenient, noting that in China, the crime of buying a panda awards up to 10 years behind bars.
Besides pandas, a person could face 5 years in detention for buying 2 parrots. So then a woman is worth less than 2 parrots. This is really unfair.
Related discussions are still snowballing on Chinese internet platforms. A former investigative reporter has since posted a video of another woman. He says she lives in the same village as the locked-up mother, and that they both arrived there around the same time.
And that's all for today's China in Focus. Thanks for watching and see you next time.